Good morning, folks. We'll wait just another minute for folks to trickle in. Don't think we're quite at critical mass yet. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll wait just another minute for folks to join and get critical mass before we get started. All right, it looks like new entries are slowing down, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Pathways Stakeholder Process Workshop number 2. We will be together for 3 hours, but don't worry, we do have a break in the middle. So we're not forcing anyone to stare at us for all 3 hours. Can I get the next slide? As a reminder where we are, a couple weeks ago, July 11th, we had our first stakeholder process workshop, introducing sort of what it is that we're trying to do here, introducing the stakeholder engagement processes used by some other ISOs and RTOs across the country. So today our focus is on how could issues and solutions before the regional organization get raised and who leads. Quick turnaround to our next workshop on August 2nd, where we'll focus on what could sector-based committee and voting structure add. And then there'll be an opportunity for written stakeholder comments. And then finally, we'll have our 4th and final workshop in this series at the end of August, where we will be reviewing a draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal. And as well, there will be an opportunity for comments on that. Next slide, please. All right, so for our time together today, per usual, we'll start with just some welcome introductions and housekeeping. And then we'll go into a presentation of a potential starting point for goals and objectives for this process. We will have some members of the launch committee and stakeholder process working group offer a dialogue on the workshop 2 topic to sort of get us started. And then, as I mentioned, we will have a break. And the latter half of the workshop is really focused on y'all's input into the workshop 2 topic. So with that, I'd like to do some brief introductions. Just as with last time, if I could have all members of the launch committee raise their hand just in Zoom. And then I know there's some overlap here, but if you're a member of the stakeholder process work group, could you also raise your hand? Great. And then finally, we had some great participation in our last workshop. If you intend to participate actively today, speaking out loud, participating actively in the chat, if you could also raise your hand. Okay, great. So we'll do some introductions based on the template here at the bottom of the slide. I will start off. My name is Neha Bazaj. I am a director at GridWorks. I don't have a sector affiliation. And the highlight of my summer is going to be a trip up to Washington next month. And we're going to go hiking in the North Cascades. So I'm actually going to start with my colleague, Peter Cogswell. Peter, I'm going to put you on the spot since you're going to be doing some of the facilitation today.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Cogswell. I'm also helping support GridWorks with some of this convening. I also, I guess, don't have a sector affiliation, but a long career working in the energy sector in the Pacific Northwest and on some issues across the West. And I'll just say the highlight of my summer is going to be an annual fishing trip that I do in central Idaho with my dad every year. So he's getting up there into his mid 80s, so I don't know how many we have left. So I'm looking forward to getting up to Idaho with him.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And then I'm just going to cold call on a bunch of people. And apologies if I mispronounce any names. Karenia, could I have you go next?
Sorry, I was trying to hit the unmute and button and it didn't seem to be working. Hi, Karinia Cusick, Center for Renewables Integration. I'm actually new to these calls, so there might be some topics you guys have already covered in the first workshop. Apologies for that. Center for Renewables Integration is a nonprofit that works primarily with distributed energy resources. So my sector affiliation would be distributed energy resources if you have that sector per se. Highlight of my summer probably already happened, which is I had a business trip to the Philippines, actually helping the Philippine government figure out how to integrate renewables onto the grid. And I was able to take a week scuba diving vacation. So super excited about that. But now I'm facing a summer of working.
Great. Thanks, Karenia. Glad you got to have some fun before all the work started. And I should clarify sector affiliation. Kathleen, correct me if I'm wrong, but your sector affiliation as represented in the launch committee. And so Kathleen, feel free to add any detail to that.
That is correct. And Karinia, I think you would probably fall in our sort of emerging tech sector. And we have 12 sectors represented on the launch committee, and I'm happy to, I can put that list in the chat just so people see it as well. But thrilled to have you join us, and welcome to our stakeholder process.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Great. Thanks both. Nora, could you go next?
Sure. Good morning, Nora Sheriff on behalf of CLECA, the California Large Energy Consumers Association. This is my first time participating in a Pathways workshop, but CLECA has had a conversation with Kathleen, and I've been looking at some of the documents. CLECA would be in the combined public interest customer advocate sector. That's the sector that I participate in for the EIM. So thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Thanks so much, Nora. Oh, go ahead.
Did you want the highlight of my summer?
Oh, yes, I definitely want the highlight of your summer.
The highlight of my summer this summer is going to be taking my daughter to college in August, which is very exciting. And then I will become a free bird. So thank you.
Awesome. Congratulations. James Hetler.
James Shetler, is that who you were asking for?
Oh, sorry about that.
I've been called worse. So I'm Jim Shetler. I represent the Balancing Authority in Northern California as its general manager. I am affiliated with the public or POU sector on the launch committee and serve in a couple of different roles on the launch committee. And the highlight for my summer just recently occurred. I got to celebrate my 75th birthday in Cabo San Lucas.
Amazing. Congratulations. Lauren.
Good morning. I sometimes there's lots of Laurens, so I'm just going to go for it and assume you're talking to me. Lauren Tenney Dennison from the Public Power Council. PPC is a trade association representing consumer-owned utilities, so we are part of the consumer-owned utility sector. And my highlight of the summer coming up, I'm based here in Portland and going to be heading out to the Oregon coast with extended family in a couple weekends. So it's been a bit of a tradition, and definitely looking forward to some cooler weather out there on the coast.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. Anyone else who'd like to share their their name, the highlight of the summer. I'd love to hear more highlights from people's summers before we get into the more intense part of our workshop. Yeah, Scott Miller.
Just real quickly, Scott Miller, Executive Director of Western Power Trading Forum. I just wanted to sort of say the highlight of my summer is actually a work-related item, but we're going to be holding our summer meeting at Big Sky Resort in Montana in the end of August. And we've already got over 150 members and a few non-members coming to it, but you know, we've still got a little bit of room. Anybody wants to come, let me know, but it should be a great networking event. But it really, it's a fantastic place. And so I'm really looking forward to it. It's the first time we've had it in Montana. So just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Kamaya.
Yeah, sure. Kimaya Abreu. I'm in regulatory affairs at Voltus. We're an aggregator of demand response and distributed energy resources. And we work in all the North American wholesale markets. I thought I'd chime in because I also had a great Western summer highlight. I spent a week in Colorado around Rocky Mountain National Park and road tripping in that area and some hot springs and whatnot. And it was my first time in that part of Colorado, and it was just so beautiful. I'm really grateful for that time.
Great. Thanks, Kamaya. If anyone else has highlights they'd like to share, I welcome you to drop them in the chat. But I think I'm going to move us forward. Sarah, can I have our next slide, please? Great. So our goals or our desired outcomes for today are to do some level setting. So in our next slide, I'll walk through some of our key takeaways that we heard from our first workshop. And then B, we get into the heart of what we're trying to do today, which is consider what a starting point could be for potential goals and objectives for this process. And then finally, begin to design what we want for the stakeholder process. So we'll be discussing that workshop 2 topic. Next slide, please. All right, so going right into what our first content area will be today. We heard in the first workshop that many of y'all wanted more clarity around the process goals and objectives for this. We also heard that any stakeholder engagement process developed should account for the fiduciary, reliability, operational, and other legal responsibilities of load-serving entities, and to balance this responsibility across stakeholders. Participants also expressed a desire for the group to be open-minded about different voting structures, and voting will be a topic of workshop 3. There were mixed opinions about which current ISO or RTO stakeholder engagement process works best. And I think while there wasn't consensus on which one works best, there did seem to be some consensus that maybe the best option draws on elements of each of those processes. And then we heard that the stakeholder engagement process should be accessible to all voices, and that whatever process is developed should be sensitive to the capacity of different stakeholders to participate. And finally, this Pathways initiative, this process that y'all are working through, is an opportunity to make an important and meaningful update to stakeholder engagement processes for markets in the West. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think just before I turn things over to Peter and we get into goals and objectives, Kathleen, could I give this over to you to share a few words about our context for today?
Absolutely. And thanks, Neha, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's great to see so many people being interested and willing to participate in this conversation. Rather than giving a full overview, kind of like I did last time, I will flag if this is your first time or you have questions about the Pathways Initiative and the work that we've done to date, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can put our email address in the in the chat here, and that will get to us, and we can make sure that we get you the information that you need. But a couple of things that I just wanted to set up here for these discussions. The stakeholder process work group is really focusing on, as we've discussed, the how we're going to be stakeholdering, both for the RO and then the relationship with the CAISO. And this has been one of the most important areas that we have heard from stakeholders, where we see opportunities to really create something that reflects the priorities and the diverse sectors that we have in the West. So that's really what we're trying to do. There's obviously we have a couple of very different kinds of stakeholdering processes in the West, through the CAISO, through SPP, through Western Power Pool. And so building on the experiences that we have and trying to pick out the pieces that collectively really work well for getting the right results and policy work done on markets for the West is really what we're aiming towards here. This is at one of 6 work groups, and there's a little bit of overlap between all of those 6. And so I wanted to sort of highlight a couple of those areas where some of the topics that may seem like they should just naturally fall in this topic are actually getting a lot more detailed attention in a different working group. So for example, we have a public interest work group that is really evaluating the role of the States Committee and of consumer advocates. So because those are really important structures and sectors in this entire sort of topic, we wanted to ensure that we were giving those groups an adequate amount of attention and detail and work. So the recommendations that come out of that group will feed into this group, and we've got a lot of interaction and crossover between our work streams to ensure that we are continuing to be aligned. Another example, there's a discussion of how and whether to use sectors in various parts of these of the new proposed regional organization. So for example, in our RO governance work group, which has a workshop tomorrow, we've been talking about sector representation on the nominating committee. At our next stakeholder process workshop next week, we'll be talking about whether, and if so, what sectors we might use for the stakeholder process. And what we want to make sure that we do is we end up with some kind of consistency between those two work streams as far as how we're defining these kinds of sectors, so that we don't have different kinds of sectors that include different groups for different aspects of the new regional organization. So I think that's probably all that I wanted to highlight today, just to make sure that we flag that just because we're not talking about something in this workshop doesn't mean that it's not something that we're addressing. And if there is something specific that you have a question about, throw it in the chat and we can let you know if that's going to be within the purview of this group or a different workshop, and we can make sure that we get you the right opportunity to engage and have your priorities and comments be heard by the launch committee and the stakeholder group at large. So with that, thanks again. Thanks to GridWorks for this facilitation, and we're excited to hear the conversation today.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Really appreciate that context. With that, Peter, I will hand things over to you.
Great. Thanks again, Neha, and good morning, everyone. I guess I'll just start, as Neha noted, in summarizing the key takeaways from the first meeting. There was this theme that kind of moved through and came up at various points during the first phase of the conversation. And it was that I think a lot of people felt it would be helpful to, I think, further refine and kind of state more clearly the goal and different objectives to support the goal of this process. I think we all kind of know generally why we're here, to support and help kind of inform a stakeholder engagement process But there's still a lot of room for interpretation under that big umbrella, and I think a lot of people just really felt like they could use a little more clarity about really what we're hoping to achieve. If anything, just to get everybody kind of working from the same starting point as the conversation moves forward from here. So that really resonated with us, and we spent some time over the last week, I think, coming up with what we would propose, or at least a starting point um, of what the kind of primary goal is that we're hoping to achieve moving forward. And then some of the different objectives we'd appreciate people keeping in mind as they kind of work to inform and kind of advance what I think will be a stakeholder engagement straw man for the RO to consider. And as we clarify the role that stakeholders are going to have in this process moving forward. So it's based on a few different things, kind of going back and reviewing the original kind of materials, including the straw proposal from the launch committee. Then some conversations with some of the launch committee members just to orient a little bit and make sure that we're all kind of viewing it the same way. And then I'll just say there's a sprinkling in of just some experience that a lot of us have working in processes like this over time and across the West. So it's a little bit of all those different columns combined to kind of create this initial document for people to review. I'll say it's very draft. Well, I shouldn't say it's very draft, but it is draft. We're very open to feedback, I guess is what I should say. And so I think with that, we'll just kind of share it. Why don't we pull it up there, Serena and Sarah, and we can kind of take a look at it. All right, and this is in the materials as well. I wasn't gonna read the whole thing, but we do have some people on via phone. And so I thought it'd be a good idea just to at least read the goal so that we can kind of start there. And then maybe I'll cover some of the different, the summary of the different objectives that we're covering here. And then I have a few questions for you, and we have a little polling exercise just to kind of see what people's kind of initial impression is of this kind of summary. So I guess the goal, as we're starting out trying to define it, is to develop a stakeholder engagement process to inform the consideration of market rules and other matters under the authority of the envisioned regional organization. And then some of the different objectives that we're hoping that people keep in mind. We want the process to be open and accessible. We want the process to be clear and consistent among different stakeholders. We want people to be able to make timely recommendations to ensure that their recommendation and perspective is shared and considered. And we want data and other relevant information to be shared, make sure the process is informed and stakeholders are informed before they make their recommendations. I tried not to use the word transparency, but I just couldn't avoid it. So we want it to be transparent. But the main thing is that people understand how their perspective and feedback was considered by the ultimate decision makers. And then finally, we want it to be adaptable. You know, we're starting out with kind of this initial phase and kind of the formation phase. But as things progress and as the process moves forward, we want it to be adaptable to cover all the different other challenges and different applications that are going to come up in the process. So with that, I guess I'll kind of stop there and just maybe open it up to, are there any questions from anyone about how we got here and just kind of what we're trying to achieve with this, kind of get everybody kind of level set. I guess I'll just open it up to the floor a little bit, Neha, and just kind of see if there's any initial questions or things that folks want to share, or I can clarify anything.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's great. And then, sorry, one thing I forgot to mention at the outset during introductions, if you do have a question or a comment, please, when you come off of mute, share your name and your organization, just so we know who you are.
Neha, I'll confess, I can't actually see if anybody's raising a hand or anything. Can you?
No, I don't see any raised hands at the moment. So perhaps we actually move to our polling exercise. So, Sarah, can we move to our next slide? All right, so I'll put this info in the chat as well. Oh, Serena just did. Great. So our question here is, what's your reaction to this starting point on a scale of 1 to 5, from hesitant being 1 to 5 being excited? And we welcome you to answer the Slido that Serena has just put in the chat. You can also scan this QR code on the screen. And then if anyone has comments that they'd like to share verbally or otherwise, you're free to do that now. And Sarah, sorry to have you bopping back and forth, but if you can also just go back to the previous slide so folks can mull on the goal and objectives for a moment before they answer the Slido. Great. And then in addition to the Slido poll, which is just asking for your general feelings, reactions to this list, we'd also welcome any thoughts you have on if there are any values or principles that feel like they are missing from this language. So we want this to be something that works for you all. So I'll just put that second question here in the chat.
Neha and Peter, it's Karinia from Center for Renewables Integration. So sometimes sort of figuring out like what you are doing is sort of defined by what you're not doing, right? So, so for example, does the scope here include sort of the authority, the limits of authority of the stakeholders versus the board? Also, I know that there's a bunch of other stakeholder work groups, but is some form of an independent market monitor being addressed here or in a different stakeholder work group?
I'm happy to jump in on that one.
Yeah.
You saw the panic in my eyes.
Yes, I got you. I got you. We are actually, the role of the market monitor is something that we have been talking about in that public interest workshop, particularly as it relates to the states committee and the consumer advocate representation. So that's where we've been talking about that so far. I think certainly will continue to be the role and sort of how it's all structured will come into our bigger conversation as we continue to move forward. But that's where we have put that part of the conversation so far.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
Thanks, Karinia. Let's see. I will read out some comments I'm seeing in the chat while we give folks another minute to do the Slido. From Brian Turner from Advanced Energy United. See that perhaps accountability is missing, knowing how stakeholder input was considered and incorporated. Let's see, Brian, I feel like maybe that's incorporated in to transparent. Invite you to come off of mute if you'd like to share a little bit more about that. I think I'm not quite seeing the distinction.
The distinction that I was considering was subject of some of the comments in our last workshop. The difference between CAISO's current process, which does not provide that transparency into how comments were considered, and the benefits of voting, which and perhaps that's the distinction there, that one of the benefits of voting is an accountable trail. We know why this proposal moved forward or did not move forward. And so transparency, I think, captures a fair bit of it. But its decision-making captures a bit more of the linkage between consideration and incorporation. So yes, I transparency, I think, gets most of the way there. I'm not asking, I guess I wouldn't ask for a big change or a different objective. Maybe it's just a slightly different flavor on transparent.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Let's see, from Kamaya, from Voltus, I have perhaps something like effective is missing as an objective. And then from Jan Strack at SDG&E, I have a suggestion that, let's see, Jan, I might have you come off mute to share your comment. I'm not sure I'm understanding it in the chat. Timely recommendations on pending proposed regional organization decisions. Is that language you would want to add somewhere?
This is really minor kind of, but it's when we have input, it's not on the decision that's already been made. I think the input you want is on the decisions that's pending or the decisions that's been proposed. So it's just a clarification. I don't think it's a big deal. Number
Great.
3.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. Fred, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, everybody. Fred here at Northwest Energy Coalition. Just to follow on Brian's comment, I have a bit of a different take on it. Voting has some value for sure. It tells you what party's entity person's view is on a completed proposal, or you can do voting, kind of straw poll voting, which I think that also has some value depending on how it's structured. But it doesn't. I think the point that Brian is trying to make that I would agree with is how can we be assured that comments, viewpoints from participants are fully represented in the decision making and knowing that it's how that is happening. I think that's a really critical thing. There are various ways to do that. It takes time and effort. I mean, one way is to do kind of the traditional comment form approach where you line out all the responses and then there's a response from the organization to each of those. That can be a lot. That can be kind of time consuming, but it does provide that kind of feedback that the comments have been fully considered.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, I think I'm hearing some similar comments from others around, not just that stakeholders are able to offer comment or input, but there's some sort of feedback loop about how it's incorporated. Let's see, a couple other comments I'm seeing in the chat, and welcome anyone to come off mute if you'd like to share more. But I see from Mona Tierney Lloyd at NL that representative seems to be missing. I think sort of building on Fred's point a little bit, from Spencer Gray, we have something to the effect of impact, that stakeholder input actually helps shape a market rule or policy outcome. And then let's see, from Laura Tenney Dennison at Public Power, I have similarly, collaborative, encouraging collaboration among stakeholders and between stakeholders and CAISO/RO staff. Let's see, yeah, and then just a response from Brian to Fred that he agrees with Fred and that he didn't mean to suggest that voting was the only or even preferred form of accountability. Let's see.
This is Vijay. Can I'm
yes,
unable to. Thank you. Vijay Satyal with WRA. Sorry, I couldn't do the poll. I'm commuting. I was listening to everything and seeing the chat screen. One of the lessons we've learned from the CalISO process is a consistent need for clarity of where or when the transparency element includes the market operator deciding what is important to initiate or take on as an initiative versus when stakeholders feel there is enough of priority and if they can justify right reasons for action right away. So I think some kind of flexibility in decision making to allow, to Spencer's point, stakeholder impact to be measured, but also initially to be reflected. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's something we should keep in mind with the new RO and being very agile. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vijay. And one thing I heard you say actually is will be a nice lead into the next part of our time together today, is talking about policy topic selection and who is it that selects even amongst a list of possible topics that could be subject to a stakeholder process.
Perfect. Thank you.
Serena, could I ask you to share your slide and see where we're at with our Slido poll in terms of, I think we're getting a little bit of a sense from the chat and conversation, how comfortable or not people are with this goal and objectives, but I'd love to see our poll results as well.
Yes, give me 1 second. You see that all right?
Yeah. Great. So I'm seeing we are mostly on the right end of the spectrum. So from 3 to 5, feeling excited or close to excited about this goal and objectives. I see a few, I don't know the numbers here, but maybe a couple of folks who've said they're rating this or ranking this as 1, that they're feeling quite hesitant. If those folks are comfortable coming off of mute to share their perspective, we're putting that in the chat. Ryan, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, this is Ryan Millard from NextEra Energy Resources. My commentary was actually back on the objectives. I don't know if we've moved on. If so, I can provide you this later.
We are still in the objectives. This was
Okay.
the polling about the objectives.
I just had a clarifying question on timely. I noticed the wording was opportunity for stakeholders to provide timely recommendations. One component of the CAISO stakeholder process that I've found frustrating as a stakeholder is that there isn't an agreed upon target date on every single initiative. Some aspects of market policy, they develop a timeline and they try to stick to it. In other areas like infrastructure policy team, they have not scoped out timelines. And I'm finding that in some working group areas, the conversation just keeps going on and on and on. And they're not holding firm to any kind of timeline. So I think of timeliness in a different component. Timeliness in the sense that stakeholders are able to engage is important, but also that the policy folks are holding to timelines so that we're actually making progress. Because I think that has been a recurring issue in the CAISO stakeholder process. It's just a lot of talking and it's not going anywhere.
Thanks, Ryan, for that. Additional commentary on all that timely could encompass. Let's see, a couple other comments I'm seeing in the chat. Is membership or qualification missing? Let's see. So I need to stare at these objectives for a moment and see where that might fall. Let's see. Karinia, I'm wondering if membership might fall under our first objective of open and accessible. But I invite you to come off mute if you'd like to share what you see as missing there.
Thank you for that. So I have sort of two, I think I saw from the grid work materials that you put together, that seems that you're sort of considering CAISO at one end of the spectrum and PJM at the other end of sort of a formal structured spectrum. So I've got a lot of experience working with both. And certainly in PJM, there's more of a structure put together of, wanting members to be the ones offering ideas, and ensuring that your stakeholders are informed. So I think that is beyond just sort of interested stakeholders, is ensuring the fact that your stakeholders have an accurate sense of what the organization is doing and are offering informed ideas. So I leave that to you if you want to sort of find a way of putting sort of informed stakeholders in there.
Thanks, Cornelia, for that additional detail. That's really helpful. All right, so some of our conversation in the chat is slowing down. I want to invite again anyone who is feeling more on the hesitant end of the spectrum with these goals and objectives. Invite you to come off mute or put in the chat, you know, what's feeling hesitant for you. Let's see, and I see from Brian in the chat. Okay, yeah, based on your early comments about accountability, maybe impact is a good alternative to that word. Accountability gets at that next layer of how stakeholder input is used and that feedback loop is completed. Right. And I will share that. So all the feedback that you're offering today via Slido, via chat, via comments, we will take what we've heard from you. We'll take another pass at this set of goal and objectives and share it again with you at our workshop next week. And hopefully we can get to a point where we're comfortable with it, using it as sort of a backbone for this process.
Yeah, and Neha, can I just add that,
Yes,
look, if folks are want to keep thinking about this, I mean, we don't have a ton of time, but you know, anything by the end of the week, we could probably incorporate or take additional feedback. So if folks have additional thoughts and, you know, want to reach out and talk about anything, we're certainly open to doing that as well, as we kind of, we'll start right away just because of the tight turnaround, taking some of this feedback back and adding it into the mix. But I don't want to limit things too much to just this conversation, because I know folks could have another thought or two that they want to raise with us. We're certainly open to it.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and at the end of our time today, we'll have our contact information up, and we can obviously put that in the chat as well.
Great.
All right. I think let's see. Okay. From Kamaya also likes the word impact over effective. So I'm hearing some consensus building around the word impact. So we'll take that back and take a second pass at this and share it with you all next week. All right, with that, I think conversation on this is slowing down a little bit. Obviously, welcome additional comments in the chat, or if you need to email myself or Peter later when good ideas come to you, that's totally fine. But I think at this time, I will turn things over to Pam for our next section.
Thank you. And I would invite my panelists to, or my fellow panelists to raise their hands and come off mute so we can make sure that we have you identified. And unfortunately, my internet connection is not really supporting video this morning, so I apologize for that. But hopefully we can go ahead and get this conversation started, and the rest of your beautiful faces will be available. So what we're going to talk about in our next topic is really focused on the shaping of stakeholder engagement. And in shaping a stakeholder engagement process for the new regional organization, we must consider various key aspects to ensure effective participation and decision-making. The role and responsibility of stakeholders in initiating, selecting, and driving forward a policy proposal can have material impacts on what issues get addressed by the regional organization. Stakeholder initiatives typically fall into one of several categories: compliance with FERC orders, initiatives to address reliability or market conduct, initiatives to incorporate state or local public policy mandates, and discretionary initiatives. In this last area, CAISO has recently incorporated a working group approach for areas of market design where stakeholders can more expansively explore concepts. Today, we are focused on the 4 key questions that you see listed on the screen here. And what we were wanting to accomplish in this section is to really share some of the deliberation that has taken place in our working group. Our working group represents a diverse array of perspectives on these questions, and we're going to really explore some of how those perspectives have been shared with the working group as we work towards driving towards some consensus recommendations for this process. So I will invite my panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will get into our conversation on these key questions. So I'll start with Meg. Meg, I think we lost you.
Might have tried to lower her.
There she is. Good morning, everyone. My name is Meg McNall, and I'm with the law firm of Thompson Coburn. I represent a group of municipal utilities in Southern California, including the cities of Anaheim, Azusa, Banning, Colton, Pasadena, and Riverside, California. We're known, I think, more commonly in stakeholder processes as the 6 cities. I am a member of the stakeholder workstream working group, not a participant on the launch committee, but very much appreciate the opportunity to coordinate on the stakeholder workstream. I serve this year as chair of the Western Energy Markets Regional Issues Forum, and I am a liaison to the RIF for the California ISO participating transmission owner sector. So very happy to be here this morning, and thank you for coordinating and inviting me to join the panel.
Scott Olson. We have 2 Scotts, as become very common in our little working group.
It is strange. I don't know how it's happened, and I don't think there's a Scott under the age of 40 in this world. If someone does know of one, please put it in the chat. Hi, folks. I'm Scott Olson. I am the Director of Western U.S. Policy, Regulatory, and Markets for Avangrid Renewables. Avangrid is a independent power producer. We own and operate about 9 gigawatts of predominantly renewable energy throughout the United States and about 3.5, 4 gigawatts of resources within the WECC. We are the only generation-only balancing authority within the Western EIM. And so absolutely all of these issues that we're dealing with as part of this working group, as part of the broader regionalization effort, is of great importance. While usually it's considered on a utility BA basis, trying to speak up for the IPP and generator sector is a key aspect that I've been participating in as part of these working groups.
Thank you, Scott. Scott Miller.
Yes, I've become known as the other Scott in the launch committee. So Scott Olson, don't feel badly. It is kind of weird to have this many Scotts. Scott Miller, as I said, I'm executive director of the Western Power Trading Forum on the launch committee, and have been active in both the stakeholder work stream as well as several others. And pleased to be doing this because I think as we get towards regional market integration, we want to make sure that governance is addressed to the extent that we can and continues to do so. I've actually chaired a stakeholder group when I worked for PJM. Governance was an issue that would occasionally crop up and was very important when I was on FERC staff. So this is an issue that everyone struggles with to get it just right. And I think it's always going to be a work in progress, but glad to engage on this. Thanks.
And Lauren.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning. Lauren Tenney Dennison. I'm the Director of Market Policy and Grid Strategy for the Public Power Council. PPC is a trade association that represents the interests of nearly 100 consumer-owned utilities across the Northwest. All of our members are preference customers of the Bonneville Power Administration. Our members, some will be participating in markets directly, some are active participants in the EIM, others are in BAs, a lot in BPA's BA, but other adjacent BAs as well that will be impacted by those their participation today in the EIM, the future in EDAM. From PPC's perspective, we've been engaged in both CAISO issues and in the Markets Plus policy development, and I serve as a liaison for the consumer-owned utility sector of the CAISO RIF. And I should mention, I'm not part of the launch committee, but one of the additions to the stakeholder process working group. So thanks for the opportunity to share some perspectives today.
Thank you. So we can turn to our first question. Question 1 on the policy topic selection. Who selects from among a list of competing priorities for stakeholder attention? The selection of policy topics for stakeholder attention is typically a collaborative effort among the different sectors within a regional organization. Today, the CAISO's policy roadmap process is an annual process that generally establishes what stakeholder initiatives we run in the upcoming year, with some flexibility to adapt the roadmap to emerging issues. Some stakeholders have called this process where good ideas go to die, but the reality is that there will always be more good ideas than bandwidth or budget to implement. Meg, I'll turn to you first as the current chair of the Regional Issues Forum. Could you please describe the changes to the roadmap process that have been implemented to date?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. So I think in thinking about the changes that the ISO has made to what is really both the catalog and the roadmap process, and I think it's important to air out the distinctions there in terminology, but there are kind of two, what I consider to be two main areas of change that have taken place in the last year. One, the ISO's process and timetable for preparing the catalog and roadmap has changed significantly relative to what it was a couple of years ago. The second major category of reform or change has really been the process that the Regional Issues Forum has undertaken as part of the outcome of the last set of Governance Review Committee reforms to undertake what has been termed a roundtable discussion of policy initiatives that could be candidates for inclusion on the roadmap. So turning to the CAISO procedural changes first, for those who have been active participants in CAISO stakeholder initiatives for a number of years, like the cities that I work with, the CAISO used to have sort of what I'll characterize as a rolling intake process for policy initiative ideas. And then they would have a sort of twice yearly process to review and incorporate that input into a catalog document. And the catalog, the way to think about the catalog is that it's kind of the laundry list of different ideas and proposals that stakeholders have put forth over time. And it was kind of a living document that would get updated periodically pursuant to the process. And that would kind of serve as the repository for stakeholder input and ideas. And then the ISO would each year go through a process to prepare a secondary document called the roadmap. And what the roadmap does is it lays out essentially the top priorities for stakeholder processes, could be ongoing processes, could be new ones, that would take place over the subsequent year, or I think the 2023 roadmap covered the a 3-year period. So the catalog is the list of initiatives from which the ISO management and staff with some input from stakeholders would pull in order to prepare this roadmap that talks about what you are actually going to do. So under the new process that was started, I think the latter part of 2024, the ISO, I think in large part in response to feedback from stakeholders along the lines of what you suggested, which is that where the catalog is where good ideas go to die, the ISO changed that to provide more openness and transparency to stakeholder input. And I think that was in part a function of the GRC related changes that I alluded to. But the process looks different now, and we're in the first year of implementing this new process. So I think all of us have a fair amount of uncertainty about how it might play out. But in essence, the ISO went to what I think of as sort of a once yearly submittal process for policy initiative ideas that occurs in roughly the first quarter of the year. I think the time frame this year was February. And then there were some RIF processes, which I'll get to in a second, but then the ISO moved to a series of stakeholder working groups whereby the parties that submitted ideas for the policy initiative catalog actually were tasked with presenting and kind of advocating for those ideas through the working groups. That process culminated in a voting procedure that took place just in last month in the June timeframe, where stakeholders actually ranked the different initiatives that they saw as sort of high and I think the categories were highest priority and then relatively high priority, neutral, and oppose. And that catalog piece culminated in a policy initiatives catalog that was published within the last couple of weeks. So the roadmap process actually hasn't happened yet. That will be occurring, as I understand it, throughout the third quarter, with the goal of finalizing the roadmap for 2025 and presumably additional years happening the latter part of 2024. So that's the CAISO's process, and that's very much from my perspective as a stakeholder and as a participant in that process. But the regional issues forum related piece that was new this year, again, outcome of the governance review committee's decision, was to include what is called the roundtable. And what that is, it's an open discussion that takes place at a RIF meeting. The open discussion is about sectors, stakeholder initiative priorities, whether those priorities are continuation of an ongoing initiative or opening a new initiative. That roundtable meeting took place on March 18th at the ISO. Each of the sectors was individually responsible for kind of gathering input from the sector and presenting that publicly, and then that culminated in a written report, which the RIF published in early May. So I've talked for a long time. I'll stop and let others jump in with their take on some of the changes that we've seen.
Scott and Lauren, as members of the Regional Issues Forum, do you want to maybe share your perspective on those changes and how the process is improving?
Yeah, I'm happy to maybe start and see what Scott has to add, but I think, you know, what Meg outlaid, it's been a helpful change. You know, we've only been through this process once, but we've already seen some good results from it. The changes that happened to the bid cap for storage resources, that was something that came, it was a resounding when we looked at all the sectors. It was pretty consistent feedback that needed attention, and it got attention very quickly. So I think, you know, it's good to have gone through this process once and seen a good outcome from that change already go into action.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things from the independent power producers and marketers sector of the RIF. we have a very large sector. We have the largest RIF sector of members, probably about 80 or so. And when we try to develop a short list, if you will, of items that our sector finds most important and present it to the California ISO as part of the workshop that Meg talked about, we did a lot of homework initially. My predecessor, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, spearheaded some internal surveys of our 80 or so members to say, here's historically the items that our sector has cared most about. Can you provide some ranking? So I think most folks on this call have seen what the California ISO has done with doing ranking of kind of the short list of items that have been put together for the roadmap. But to even come up with that short list will take work and time. And that's where I think things like the RIF has become pretty engaged, to try to narrow down some of the key items that a broad set of membership might be interested in, provide that to the sector, and then that can be the basis for moving forward. We've been pretty content with how the California ISO has utilized our shortlist. Some items were selected, some items were not. There is certainly a transparency issue that we're concerned about a bit, to say why were certain items selected, why were other items not selected. Same sort of thing when it comes to the recent survey that was done for weighting and voting for priority initiatives. What will this mean for actual things that do move forward within the policy roadmap? So we're definitely supportive of the changes that have been made, certainly see some additional tweaks to make it even better. Lauren mentioned the soft offer cap as being quite the success, as saying, here's an item that members found very important, and the California ISO moved quickly in order to get those changes. Keep in mind that this issue is not a new issue. This got brought up more than 2 years ago by stakeholders to say, you should pay attention to this. California ISO did not put priority on it, but the recent changes, as Meg talked about, as Lauren talked about, I think that has put more power, if you will, to the stakeholders to drive some of these initiatives, especially ones that are time sensitive. And that's been a very beneficial change.
Thank you for that insight. So turning to you, Lauren, you've been an active participant in the SPP process for Markets Plus. Can you share some of the differences in that process and what aspects of that approach that you find valuable?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. And maybe just to acknowledge that the Markets Plus development is in a bit of a different stage. It's in the, folks have gone through building the tariff, now working on the protocols. It's a little different than working on changes to an active market. But I think it's important to talk about some of the structural differences in Markets Plus, the way the stakeholder group works together. Markets Plus relies on standing work groups and ad hoc task forces that tend to be a little bit more structured, longer term. And as part of those work group and task forces, there are folks from the sectors actually assigned to serve on those. So there's voting that goes on within those work groups and sectors in work groups and task forces among those sector representatives on what the policy should look like, whether the policy should advance, and also on the prioritization of specific issues within the time that's had. Additionally, while all decisions go to an independent board, eventually they build up through the working group level. Then there's the Markets Plus Executive Committee, the MPEC, that has representatives from all the participants and stakeholders. That group is also able to direct work back to those work groups and task forces. So there's just more structure involved that has stakeholders having an active voice through this voting mechanism on what to prioritize and what needs to be looked at. Now, that's very highly informed, especially in this phase where it's been tariff development, protocol development. Really, SPP staff has been providing a lot of expertise, driving what needs to be talked about, what needs to be addressed. But the priority of, just for folks that haven't participated in that Markets Plus process, it was really starting with the Eastern SPP RTO tariff and looking at where are changes needed. So SPP staff helped identify some of those areas, but it was also up to stakeholders to identify areas where they thought changes were needed. And then to the extent that those needed to be prioritized, that was also a discussion amongst that stakeholder group at those multiple levels. So I think one of the things that's so appealing, or at least that PPC has had a positive experience with that process, is the level of stakeholder engagement and ability to influence while being informed by the market operator staff, because that staff is very informed. Their knowledge is super important to have in the conversation. But really, it sort of becomes almost a partnership between the staff that's advancing and advising the stakeholders that then have the ultimate authority to sort of drive through that voting mechanism, what gets worked on and what gets prioritized. Again, we're in a bit of a different stage, so we'll be moving, if as that gets stood up, it would be interesting to see there is a process for folks to identify how topics are changed or addressed, but really it's open in those working groups to anybody, whether they're working group members, whether it's the market monitor, whether it's stakeholders that aren't part of the official working group. Anyone can raise those issues to the working group for consideration to be addressed or worked on or considered. And so that's something that, again, that broad level of involvement and sort of instant ability to get some feedback from the stakeholders as a collective through that voting mechanism has been something that PPC has had a positive experience with.
Thank you, Lauren, for sharing that perspective. I'd love to I think it's clear we could spend our entire time on this question. We have so much to converse on, but we're giving short shift to our other 3 questions here. So I think it's important to move on. Question 2, the originating the policy framing and who first presents a problem statement and solutions range. In the current CAISO process, an initiative can be selected for immediate consideration in a stakeholder process if it is sufficiently defined, or selected for a working group if the problem statement has not yet been fully defined, or there are more questions that stakeholders might have about the framing of the initiative. Today, CAISO staff lead these processes and stakeholders provide written or verbal comment into that process to help shape it. So turning back to you, Lauren, from your perspective, can you please share some of the key differences between a staff versus a stakeholder-driven process?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. And I think I started to touch on this a little bit in my discussion with the last question, but I do think if we look at the Markets Plus example specifically, the idea that there are certain folks assigned to those working groups, and those working groups have they're basically the ones that determine the direction ultimately. Again, working very closely, market operator staff has a very key role. But there's that greater buy-in and ownership. The fact that the working groups have assigned folks that are voting on these topics, I think there is, and each working group has a chair and vice chair that really helps steer the direction of that group. And I think that adds a level of ownership and responsibility and accountability for stakeholders that has been, again, I think helpful in both, setting a clear expectation for the balance of how the market operator staff and the stakeholders work together. I think it's also led to some opportunities for greater collaboration because there's this voting mechanism. It's not just entities appealing to the staff for what gets in the proposal. Entities need to work with each other as stakeholders to try to gain support if there's someone that has a challenge with the direction that the issue is going. They're really incentivized to bring solutions and not just problems, because folks will be looking to support something that can move forward. So that's those are some of the benefits that PPC has seen from that stakeholder-led process. And I think there's things that CAISO is looking at and starting to adapt in some of their working group approaches as well.
Thank you, Lauren. Scott Miller, your turn to chime in. You've participated in both the CAISO process and the Markets Plus process, as well as some experience in Eastern markets. Can you expand on some of the differences that Lauren shared from your perspective?
Oh, thanks, Pam. And I'm glad, Lauren, that you made the point about the sort of different place that Markets Plus is, as opposed to, just sort of building on the tariff. Because it provided a template that was fairly easy to go into. But I will say that I was quoted in the trade press last year as saying the SPP Markets Plus stakeholder process had charmed the participants because of it being driven by the stakeholders, but with the strong collaboration with staff. I'll just say that one of the other things that made the process at this point with Markets Plus fairly easy and collaboration was fairly easy to get into is that even in this formative stage, it's still, and I'm on the MPEC and I'm also on the Market Design Working Group. It's still at this stage a fairly small group of people when you compare it to the CAISO stakeholder process. And everyone is highly incented to try to get to a tariff to get started. That's a little bit different than when you get into a mature stakeholder process where people are seeing some issues that they wanted identified, and other groups are maybe not as focused on that particular area. But I will say that I like the fact that CAISO has changed because when I first came back west after being on FERC staff and to the WPTF role, and I saw the interaction where it was a very staff-driven process, the CAISO has made an adjustment and is continuing to make an adjustment because it is a culture change. And when you first get into a situation where it's not just the staff coming up with things and asking the stakeholders what they want to do, it sometimes takes a while for the stakeholders to sort of recognize that they've got something that they're required to do. And Warren, I don't know if you remember, but back in the first few meetings, they were kind of like, can I get a motion?
Oh, it was a big learning curve.
Yeah, and you'd see people sort of go, raise their hand. So so I want to say that there are some aspects of the SPP Markets Plus process whereby you've really got a stakeholder who's in charge of say a working group or a committee, but you've got that working relationship with the staff because the staff really is going to organize things, help things along, and they need, they've got that expertise in terms of the nitty-gritty details of the tariff. So I see some real benefits in terms of the SPP Markets Plus, but recognize it's in a different place. I like that CAISO is beginning to change, but in whatever we come up with, it's going to require some, stakeholders are going to have to recognize what their role is in it. And work collaboratively, and that could be a challenge. That could be a challenge.
Thank you both for sharing that perspective. I think we can continue to touch on this topic, but maybe transition a little bit also into focusing on the stakeholder-led workshops. And so I'll turn to Scott Olson and Meg to share from your perspective how the working group process is going and what enhancements could we think about incorporating from other experiences to strengthen the role of the stakeholder in this process. Are there any drawbacks to the working group process, and how would we potentially address those?
I'll go ahead and start, and I'll hand it over to Meg for those of you that don't get the joy of being part of CAISO stakeholder processes. I believe there's 4 right now that have adopted the new approach for getting a lot more stakeholder engagement, resource adequacy, greenhouse gas coordination, price formation enhancements, and gas resource management. So in my opinion, CAISO has gotten the message that the days of here is a straw proposal, what do you think? Few changes. Here's a draft proposal, what do you think? Few changes, but generally what's in the straw proposal is the thing that kind of moves forward. I think that when the California ISO had their RA proposals back in 2020, 2021, where they wanted to make pretty significant changes within the RA program, and it faced a lot of pushback from stakeholders. And the ISO, to their credit, said, okay, let's slow down and let's have a more methodical approach to this. I think all of that has been very, very beneficial. We certainly appreciate that the ISO has given a voice to stakeholders for being more part of the process. One of the big things that all 4 of these do is to develop a problem statement. So sometimes the ISO will say, we're going to make this change historically, and folks go, why are you making this change? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And that's the number one thing that all 4 of these stakeholder groups have done, to say, what are we actually trying to solve? What is the issue? And then giving some agency to individual stakeholders to say, who wants to take control over defining this problem statement? That's been really a beneficial portion of the process. So that's on the plus column. On the negative column, I think my colleague at a slightly larger renewable energy company, Ryan Millard, put it well this morning when he said, it's been a little slow. And that's something that I think folks in the California ISO process aren't entirely used to. For example, the Greenhouse Gas Coordination Initiative launched in August of 2023. There's been 10 working groups, and we're just now getting to defining some actual solutions to the problem. So almost a year in, and we're not even quite at the specifics for, all right, here's where we think we're going to go. That leads to a lot of stakeholder fatigue. It leads to a lot of time and effort being spent by stakeholders that only specific firms can really spend that amount of time. This is why having kind of a balance between, in our opinion, some ISO-driven items and some stakeholder-driven items, so that stakeholders can provide input when they need, and then have the staff take over certain aspects we think makes sense. When we're moving, as we're moving to this whole new policy roadmap process, it is giving the ability of all the RIF sectors and members of the RIF sectors to already define problem statements, already define some potential solutions. And if that's going to be the process going forward, in theory, we think this should make all of these processes a little bit better. Instead of spending 11 months defining the problem, the roadmap now already has the problem generally defined, has feedback from parties, has feedback from status. It's a better starting point that is driven by stakeholders, that now staff and stakeholders can work together to find a solution.
Yeah, I agree with most of what Scott pointed out with respect to the current working group process. The key, I think, pain point that I have observed is that the working group process takes a long time, and it's not clear when we're done and who decides when we're done. So not to pick on specific initiatives, but the initiatives that are subject to working group processes currently, and I'm thinking of the RA initiative, the greenhouse gas initiative, the gas resource management, and I think I'm missing one, the price formation. Those are all, maybe with the exception of the gas resource management initiative, those are wide-ranging topics, and stakeholders have identified sort of numerous issues and permutations of issues that may need to be addressed as a part of that process. What hasn't always been clear is when we have fully ventilated what a problem statement is or should be, when to cut that off and start moving to the policy development phase where we talk about the solutions and developing the solutions. And a lot of times there's spillover in discussing the problems toward developing solutions. But I think one area where it would be really beneficial to have more stakeholder sort of direct input and involvement is when we're done with the working groups and when we're moving to solutions. And there isn't really a clear process for that right now. One of the differences that I've noticed with gas resource management is that, to me, that initiative has struck me as a bit more narrowly focused than the other three. And so the development of the problem statements, I think, has been, I don't want to say it's been an easier process, but there has been a group of stakeholders from my perspective that have been pretty hands-on with providing input there. And I think, again, my observation, but I think that process has gone a little bit more. I don't want to say it's gone quickly because the initiative is still sort of happening, but I think that having a more discrete set of issues has been helpful in letting the working group process be a bit more focused than maybe some of the other initiatives.
Thank you for those comments and that perspective. So Scott Miller and Lauren, the working groups take more time and resources to participate, and many stakeholders have found staffing the CAISO working groups challenging. Can you share your perspective on why this is a challenge with the CAISO process and not with the SPP process?
Yeah, I could start off, and I guess I would say I'm not sure it isn't a process or isn't a problem in the Markets Plus process. I think, Scott really hit on a few key things in the difference of talking about where the stage of Markets Plus is versus making changes to the CAISO markets. And I think, the sort of cultural showing up, knowing folks were going to get something different, being ready to kind of work through what it took to do something different, knowing that there was a pretty drawn out and specific timeline to complete what was going on, and having a pretty clear structure on what their role would be. I think all of those aspects made it easier for folks, or I don't even know if it's easier, but I think those are things that helped people buy into providing.
The newness of it?
Huh?
The newness of it?
Yes, the newness of it. And also just, I think, having Meg brought up, when is the decision decided? There sort of was a path of, there's that you're going to have these discussions, you're going to need to make these decisions. And I think having sort of that A to B, here's how the process is going to work through the whole process, as well as the pushing point that Scott, you brought up earlier of, like, you want to get a tariff done in a certain amount of time. I think that helped people buy in and make that commitment. But I don't think it was necessarily, I don't think anybody did not feel overwhelmed with the amount of meetings on their calendars.
Yeah, and it's funny because the stakeholder process was predicated on what your goal was in terms of the date for the tariff submission. And there was initially an SPP goal that some of the stakeholders came in and said, no, we want it faster. And I will tell you, just speaking from a personal standpoint, the November, December, January timeframe, it was frantic. It was just, and thank God I had people like Caitlin Leotiris working for us, Claire Bridnich, Carrie Bentley, Callie Wells, because covering all this stuff, greenhouse gas accounting, transmission, congestion, and all that sort of stuff. It was brutal. And I think that what I don't think that there really is a difference between the two if you get into a mature structure. Because one of the things about PJM, it's very stakeholder driven, and it's very, they really get into it. But I will tell you, you get a lot of stakeholder fatigue, and people have to staff up for that sort of thing. And so there's this balance that we're going to have to try to attain, whereby there is stakeholder involvement and we reach all the goals and objectives that we've just set out there in terms of transparency, responsiveness, and all that sort of stuff, without wearing out, either A, wearing out the stakeholders, or B, requiring a very expensive staffing up. It's a balance to be struck. Now the stakeholder process in SPP is slowed down because we're in the protocol section So it's much more moderate at the time when CAISO is beginning to speed up its working group process. So it's fortunately it's seldom been at the same time, but there isn't a whole lot of difference in terms of the staffing and the rapidity of working groups.
Maybe one thing I will add, I think there is a bit of a difference in the like formalized responsibility for folks that are on the working groups. And then for participants, I think, if you're on the MPEC, at the end of the day, folks will be voting on this outcome. You will be responsible. You essentially own and are responsible for creating whatever comes out of the process. So I think that makes you can't really sidestep that, I think, is one of the things that, it doesn't necessarily combat fatigue, but it makes it harder to give up the participation, if that makes sense.
Good point, Lauren. Good point. And that's something that you need in any process.
I'll note that we're getting some really great comments in chat, but we have about 5 minutes left in this group, and then we will go to stakeholder comments. And I hope the folks who are continue to actively participate in the chat, and then we can address some of these comments as we get into the dialogue portion of our discussion today. Jumping to this last question in our remaining time. When we think about whether an initiative is really ready to go to that formal stakeholder process that I think Scott described as shaping an initiative on the margins versus this working group process where we're trying to have stakeholders define problem statements and sponsor problem statements, and it can take a little bit longer to get there. I think the question we're facing here is, how do we decide when an initiative is ready to go to that quick and formal process versus when do we put it into a working group process? And maybe I'll start with Meg and see if there's a role for the Regional Issues Forum in assigning stakeholders to lead these working groups or to help drive how we determine if something should go first to a working group process.
Yeah, so I think this touches on some of the resource issues that Lauren and Scott just mentioned. And in terms of the role of a RIF or a RIF-like organization here, I think the answer is yes. There is a role for the RIF in helping with that decision point in terms of whether to advance an initiative from the problem statement phase to solutioning. But I think that's contingent on the ability and the willingness of stakeholders to take that on, because I think it cannot be just something that a small group of volunteer liaisons, do sort of periodically. I think it takes a greater level of commitment on the part of members of the RIF, i.e. the stakeholder community, to help kind of shape that part of the working group process. So yes, but I think it would take some of that cultural shift that we've talked about. And we'd have to figure out how to make sure that the role of stakeholders in sort of assisting with that transition in the working group process, whether they're able to kind of give full consideration to what could be very different views of stakeholders about whether a particular initiative is ready to move forward or not.
And anyone have some last closing thoughts for us here today?
I never mentioned what my highlight of the summer is, and if things go as planned, may have a family conflict, but I'm hoping to go to an escape room convention in Los Angeles in August because I'm a nerd. But the other thing I wanted to say is, you said at the outset, Pam, where good ideas go to die. And I think that historically, that's not that far from the truth. And again, if you just look at a case study of the soft offer cap change, again, that had been suggested years ago, and there was no action whatsoever on it. Now I think that the California ISO has put more impetus and weight behind the interest in stakeholders. We have seen the proof in the pudding that something like that did bubble up to the front once it was highlighted at that regional issues forum that Meg talked about in March, and action was made more quickly on something like that was stakeholder led than I can remember in a time with the California ISO. Does that mean it's perfect? Of course not. Does that mean everything's going to be that way? Of course not. But that's certainly a great first step that I think gives a lot of stakeholders a positive outlook on where the California ISO is heading.
Scott, I think you've just introduced a new metaphor. Maybe we can call the working group process the escape room of good ideas, where you have to slog it out with a team of your favorite stranger colleagues in order to make it to the pathway of the real stakeholder process.
While being chased by a zombie. Yeah, so
yes,
yeah, agreed.
Scott, I'm glad you identified yourself.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yes.
So I'll turn it back to our facilitators and a break.
Hey, Pam.
Tony, there's a section for comments next, but go ahead.
Oh, go for it. Go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. In the interest of giving folks a little bit of a break and then consolidating all of our good discussion from participants, we are going to go break for 10 minutes. So where I am, that means back at 10:40 or 11:40 or 12:40, depending on which time zone you're in. And then we will have over an hour, I think 75 minutes or more to take all your good comments and discussion. So thank you, Tony, for holding your comments until after our break. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you got a chance to stretch your legs, get some water. Serena or Sarah, I can't remember who's sharing slides, but we can move on to yeah, our next slide, please. All right, so we have about an hour and 20 minutes left together. And this time is really reserved for discussion amongst the rest of y'all who were not on Pam's panel to share your thoughts on the workshop 2 topic, which is how could issues and solutions before the regional organization get raised, and who leads. So sort of 4 elements to that broad question: policy topic selection, originating policy framing, stakeholder-led workshops, and selectivity of bottoms-up stakeholdering. So we heard the folks just now share their thoughts on the workshop question and these 4 elements. And I saw some great comments in the chat, which perhaps we can open, but then I'd really like to lead us through this series of reflection questions. So I believe first in the chat we had Fred. Fred, I'll invite you actually to just come off mute and share your comments out loud if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, just an observation about, and specifically about SPP Markets Plus, but I think this is a more general thought, that when you have a voting process, the dilemma is, do you have a representational process like the SPP committees are structured? Or do you have, and the RIF, by the way, same thing. Or do you have an open-ended process where anybody can show up, or maybe with some kind of criteria can just sit and vote, sit on the body and vote? And there's pluses and minuses to both of them. The issue I've been thinking a lot, though, as I previously mentioned, is we're going to be, the RO will be operating in a context where there's going to be a lot more participation. We've already seen a significant growth in my estimation over the last few years of participation in the CAISO stakeholder process. How does it scale? And this raises the question, if you have 30 people in the room, that's one thing. If you have 150, that's another. And, how do you, if you have a voting process, how do you do it? And if you then move to a more of a structured approach for the voting in terms of the committee representation, then we run into the issue that we've seen at SPP, where if a committee is already full, and if you're a new entrant into the process, or for some reason your organization has decided that's an issue you really want to focus on, you may not be able to vote for quite a while. Now, in theory, you should be able to get some kind of dialogue with people who are our voting members. So, but on the other hand, if you have it completely open-ended, then you can have people coming in late, not really fully understanding the issues, groups coming in and kind of, tipping the balance on, broadly speaking, the diversity of the group. I mean, there's all kinds of issues here. So that's really the comment that I wanted to raise, that there are trade-offs in all of this.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, that certainly seems to be the theme. And just as a reminder, our next workshop next week will have more of a focus on the potential for voting and what that might look like. See, I'm going to go in order here. Ryan, you had also put a comment in the chat during the panel discussion. Would you like to come off mute and share your thoughts out loud? See, I'm actually not sure if Ryan is still with us. So for the sake of folks on the phone, I will read his comment out loud. Ryan Millard of Next Era Energy Resources shared that CAISO's working group structure lacks a charge. Milestones and deadlines seem secondary. Deliverables can be unclear. For example, revised draft, second revised draft, draft final, final addendums, etc. Scoping and buy-in at the beginning is great and should be inclusive, but in the absence of a target, we can start to swirl. Vijay, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I've been on these couple of workshops now, two of these calls. It's very easy to criticize what is not working, or it's very easy to identify the flaws. One thing has to be recognized, the fact that we are in this state of conversation to comment and opine on the work groups is a fact of improvement and progress being made. So let's take the best of what we saw. One comment I would like to make, which is a bit contrary to one of my RIF colleagues brought up, and hi RIF team, is that when CalISO was working towards a tariff, the work groups were still in place then, but there was a very thoughtful effort by staff to present what is the policy questions, what do we want to achieve, and where do we want to end. What is missing with both our experiences with SPP in the West and CalISO is sometimes an understanding of the staff's ability and tools available. An understanding of the staff's capability and what they can bring to the table needs to be a conversation at the beginning when policy goals are being set for that particular stakeholder proposal. Item one. And item two I want to bring up is, I think there needs to be a parallel approach where the RO, for example, in the future will propose their own stakeholder policy proposals that warrant attention. And then the stakeholders might say, we feel this is more important. And in those matters, they go to a board or decision-making or review team that helps decide which moves forward. Let's face it, some of the RIF members come from a developing community that has vested interest to just put steel in the ground as fast as possible. Let's face it, I represent public interest that wants what is a good market design that will work for a long time. Not that the IPP sector or others don't want a good market setup, but sometimes sectoral interests can supersede what is good for the larger market. So balancing of interests where a good market needs to work long-term versus immediate short-term needs or goals need to be balanced as well. That was not captured or admitted to. And number three, my last one is on what appears to be key differences among the approaches offered. I think my wonderful colleague with a lot more experience, Scott Miller, touched upon how he had a whole team of resources to engage in the SPP effort, because that was on the clock, like a 4 by 100 meter relay shot into a time frame of who can get there fastest. Does that give us quality? We don't know. So quality control should be another element of whatever we come up with in terms of stakeholder proposal selection. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Tony, I'll invite you to share your comments out loud, and then I am going to move us through the reflection questions in a stepwise manner, but Tony, go ahead.
Thanks. Nothing earth-shattering and certainly nothing specific, but I just want to applaud the discussion today. You know, that this is an issue that has been wrestled with since the beginning of time, and it hasn't always been a realistic discussion. It hasn't always been a constructive discussion, but I think everything that's being added here today is very helpful and put forward in a progressive and problem-solving manner. So I just want to say thank you to everyone that's helped put this together and chimed in today.
Great. Thanks for your comments, Tony. And yeah, welcome your comments, anyone else's comments on the specific reflection questions as well, if they come to you later. So I am going to start us off with the first one and invite our launch committee representatives to participate, those who raised their hands at the beginning of the workshop to participate. And I'm curious to hear which launch committee perspectives stood out to you. And Vijay, I see your hand is still raised. I'm not sure if that's intentional. And your comments about which launch committee's perspectives stood out to you could be on any of the four topics that they discussed. It could be about policy topic selection, originating policy framing, stakeholder-led workshops, or selectivity of bottoms-up stakeholdering.
Well, Nehan, since everybody seems to be so quiet, I'll help you out. This is Karinia Cusick from Center for Renewables Integration. I was interested in the fact that it seems that really the primary two perspectives that are being brought to the table are CAISO and SPP. And obviously, I think that's natural, given where most people have most of their experience. But obviously, there are other ISOs to draw from. You know, maybe I don't really know the size of this, sort of understand completely the size of this regional organization is supposed to be, but I know that GridWorks did a nice job in their paper of sort of polling other ISOs. I just wonder whether we also want to try to intentionally look at some other ISOs beyond just CAISO and SPP. And I think it's great that everybody's got a ton of experience with those two, but you know, the world is a little bit broader than that.
Thanks, Karinia, for being brave. And if I can ask you a follow-up question, getting ahead of myself a little bit here in my reflection questions, but I think you shared that you have experience with PJM. So I'm wondering, based on your comments, were there points of view or perspectives that you didn't hear represented by the launch committee and stakeholder working group members in that panel discussion that you would want to bring forward?
I think that I don't I actually don't know SPP very well. I haven't worked in SPP. So that's one of my challenges, but I know that PJM has a very structured process for allowing stakeholders to bring forward issues and sort of vote on the process and priorities. And that's basically, you know, their issue, charge, and problem statement structure. And so it does allow entities to move forward an issue in a relatively short time frame and get it high on the priority list if they get it sort of successfully voted on by other members. So maybe just sort of taking a look at the issue charge, problem statement, issue charge structure that PJM uses might be helpful, because it does and then it also is a weeding out process, right? I mean, stuff gets voted down, it gets voted down. You got to come back and figure out how to reframe it and make it an issue that people see as important. So maybe taking a moment to look at the issue charge process in PJM might be helpful.
Great. Thanks for that additional detail, Karinia. Yeah, and I want to note we're certainly not trying to limit the discussion today to what occurs in CAISO or what occurs in SPP. To your point, that is, I think, where most of the folks on this call have their experience. But welcome you to draw on any of y'all's experience outside of those two markets, as well as, you know, ideas you have that aren't currently represented by any of the ISOs or RTOs. Ryan.
Yeah, this is Ryan Millard from NextEra Energy Resources. Really appreciate the comment from Karinia. I don't have experience in PJM, but I know that there are stakeholder folks who do, and I always appreciate those perspectives, and that's what I kind of hinted on in my chat comment there. I really like the fact, and I think someone who knows PJM better may be able to correct me, but on the problem statement side, it seems to be pretty inclusive in the sense that it can be drafted by PJM, a stakeholder, or a group of stakeholders, so you get that kind of broader scoping. But then what Karinia noted, and what I tried to note in my comment, was that lack of charge in the problem statement is what doesn't exist in the CAISO, which I think would be an interesting place to explore, because that charge is where you start to identify expected deliverables. You start to identify whom the issue is assigned to, key areas of expected activity or areas that are not intended for activity, you know, expected overall duration of work. There's a lack of formality that exists in the CAISO's working group that I would like to see blended into that and explored a little bit more, without totally abandoning, you know, the inclusivity of having those informal discussions, which I think are really pivotal. I think Mary Winkie picked up on this in the last or the first working group discussion we had on this topic, which is there are benefits to both sides. So I'm not a big fan or proponent of an overly formalized committee structure, but I do see the benefits of having some formalized structure just to keep things moving in a progressive direction versus what I mentioned, our tendency to kind of swirl.
Thanks, Ryan, for your comments. Spencer, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Neha. Spencer Gray here with NIPSI. And I appreciated the comments from Karina and from Ryan. I wanted to offer a couple thoughts. And I'm an alternate on the launch committee, so I've been happy to participate in some of these stakeholder work group discussions too. We have taken a look at the GridWorks research, and some of us have drawn on some of our own experience in dealing with the other RTOs and ISOs around the country. And I wanted to make one point about PJM, which has been, I think, a rich source of examples for us, but also there's an important contrasting point, I think, for keeping in mind about stakeholdering. Clearly, more folks in the West have experience with the CAISO process and with SPP recently through Markets Plus. PJM's members and transmission owners continuing to have either shared or sold 205 rights for filings by PJM, I think gives a very different flavor for stakeholder in there, because initiatives can essentially get sort of held hostage by the stakeholder process in the absence of a necessary supermajority of support from stakeholders. And one thing that distinguishes both the CAISO and SPP process is even in SPP, which is a more intensive and involved stakeholder process in terms of its formality, the stakeholders still don't have actual 205 rights the way that asset owners and members of PJM do. Now, culturally, my experience in Markets Plus on the MPEC is that the stakeholder voting is very strong, so it's very strongly advisory. But that sort of basic distinction, I think, is important, and at least for me, is maybe a little bit cautious about drawing too much from PJM examples. We have done a little bit more research on ISO New England, and one example that's been attractive, I think, to me at least, so I'll share this here with the group, is an approach that's relatively recent in New England of having RTO staff sort of paired with volunteer stakeholder representatives from their stakeholder organization, NEPOOL. So there's a chair and a vice chair of work groups and committees, so that the RTO staff and then an appointed person among stakeholders is setting the agenda and helping to frame topics, and also avoid some of the sort of wheel spinning, I think, that Ryan and others identified as one challenge in the CAISO process. So that may be an area for other folks to consider drawing as a strength for us to consider here for the RO. And then one last thing I wanted to just offer out for reactions or reflections from others. My own experience in Markets Plus representing NIPSI was I appreciated a lot of the democratic elements of voting on the MPEC. I think Lauren and Scott Miller spoke really accurately to how that approach of having stakeholders own more of the problem identification and solution identification leads to more collaboration, which I found very fruitful. It also sort of relieves some of the pressure on the RTO or ISO staff, but the level of intensity of it can be exhausting. And I think that's true whether you're trying to finish a tariff on a timeline or just in the normal course of business. So I've been interested in exploring whether there's merit in having different intensities of stakeholder process depending on the topic. We spoke a little bit earlier this session about the natural gas work group that maybe was scoped with less interest from stakeholders within the CAISO than some of the other work groups. So it sort of makes sense to me that some issues would benefit more from more intensive stakeholdering than others. And so perhaps a tiered approach of more intensive input makes sense for some issues and less sense for other issues.
Thanks, Spencer, for those detailed comments. I think you hit on a number of aspects of the workshop 2 topic. Scott Miller, I saw your hand raised earlier. I don't know if you still have a comment you'd like to share.
Well, I wanted to underpin a couple of Spencer's comments in that regard. First of all, I would not necessarily, well, the PJM stakeholder process is fairly robust and very robust. And I would never want to repeat this PJM stakeholder process because, as Spencer pointed out, most of the 205 rights reside with the members committee rather than the board. I think in many instances that has led to the inability of the members to drive consensus. They were the PJM's had extreme difficulties in terms of reforming its capacity market, and 206 filings or its PJM's board alternative for doing that. That's a much higher legal standard. I don't think that we want to burden any RO or anything in the West with anything like that. Similarly, the research that Spencer led, and I to some extent participated in it, with regard to the New England process, which it's a kind of stakeholder involvement that sort of drives the initiative process, but then it is not as intensive as sort of the PJM process is something that's attractive and maybe something that like the RO could evolve to, building on what the CAISO has been doing lately. But so it's the process needs to be one that's balanced, both in terms of what it calls upon for the stakeholders, but also doesn't be so stakeholder driven that the board's responsibilities are severely handicapped. So I thought just wanted to add some emphasis to what Spencer's, I thought, very important comments were.
Thanks so much, Scott. Yeah, hearing a lot of folks comment on a need for balance. Looking back at our reflection questions, so I think you've heard a little bit about which perspectives that were already shared has stood out. Curious if there's any other, we've heard a little bit about points of views that didn't feel completely represented in that panel discussion. Are there any other points of views that folks didn't hear represented by that panel discussion that they'd like to offer? Letha, I apologize if I'm not saying your name properly.
Not at all. Thank you. Of course, the state regulators conversation is robust in the public interest group, so I don't want to bring that in here per se, but I would like to highlight that while we need to look at what is working across the country, and I really appreciated Fred's comment in the first stakeholder workshop, thinking innovatively about what we might want to do given all that lessons learned. I think in the context of balance, we have to remember how sort of structurally uncompetitive the Western grid is. The structure of the loads, the structure of the transmission system, the way in which we swing from surplus to deficit from year to year through the wonderful and fantastic endowment of hydro, creates a real challenge that fundamentally shaped how CAISO's governance works coming out of our history in the last. And I think throughout all of this, we have to keep in mind that we are managing for a structurally uncompetitive grid where the East has the opportunity for more infrastructure to make it competitive. And so I think it's a color we have to keep that really has driven a lot of the culture in the CAISO, and we need to take the best parts of that forward, not not the worst parts of that. So just a piece of color to add to the conversation around balance.
Thanks so much, Letha. Jessica Zanau, I saw that you put a comment in the chat earlier, and I apologize that I didn't call on you or offer you an opportunity to share your comments out loud. If you'd like to do so now.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. No need, really. Lauren hit on the points really well, but and other folks have too. But just wanted to say that, you know, there needs to be some kind of an element of expectation that change is achievable, and that has not always been the experience. And you know, recent activity at CAISO is staff is obviously making efforts, but that hasn't always been our experience that change is achievable, or that there's any sort of circle back or accountability for any kind of effort or comments or engagement at the stakeholder level. So that needs to be present in order for engagement to be durable in any process. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Can I just ask a clarifying question? When you say like a feeling or a hope that change is possible, you mean change in terms of like if y'all are working on a policy topic, like there's some hope that like something will change or become different, that there'll be some movement on that policy topic.
Right. And just because it's fresh and recent, I'll give yesterday as an example, the Pathways Initiative. You know, we put a lot of effort into providing some constructive feedback of things that we don't believe it's ready to go forward for a board vote. And some things that we wanted to see, we were willing to take a neutral position, but some things we wanted to see. And there was approximately 30 minutes to, you know, kind of discuss all of those things. And we were kind of told these issues don't rise to the level of importance of needing to be addressed. And to me, that's disheartening and causes engagement to, you know, cause you to want to pull back and not want to engage in the future.
Thanks for that additional detail.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite, if we have any consumer representatives on the Zoom line, consumer advocates, any other regulators, I'd like to invite y'all to raise your hands and share any perspectives you have about you know, points of views that were not yet represented during that panel discussion. Or alternatively, any perspectives that you felt really comfortable with or ones that you felt challenged by. Yes, Fred.
Although we do some consumer representation, I'm not addressing that. So I want to make sure that if anybody from that group has something to say, they get one more chance before I change the subject.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe we'll just pause for another few seconds. And this is certainly not the last opportunity for consumer representatives or advocates to share their perspective. All right. Fred, go ahead and share your comment. And if you could just, I know you've done it already, but if you wouldn't mind just sharing your affiliation as well.
Yeah, Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. For those that don't know, we are active in the 4 Northwest states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. We have about 100 organizational members. We have some individual members, but we're primarily organizational coalition. And actually, we have a couple of utility members along with a wide range of environmental and community and other groups. So the point I think I'm going to jump down to number 5 here, really. I think that's the entry point. And going back actually to the list of questions from right before the break, I'm going from screen to screen here. So the key questions that you mentioned, one of which is the third one, stakeholder-led workshops, who has responsibility for facilitating a discussion and so forth. The this may or may not be the best time to talk about this, so I'll just put it out there as an idea, not a proposal, which is I think there should be some consideration. I think one thing we haven't talked about, at least I have not heard, is discussion of who actually facilitates these stakeholder initiative processes, at the meetings, preparing agendas, all those kinds of things, and help steer them. I think there's a tendency to think of it as either being a staff function or a stakeholder function. And I'm suggesting we might want to think about an approach where you'd have both. In effect, for a given initiative, have one possibility is to have one from staff, one from the stakeholder side. Selected. I'm going to avoid all of the details here, selected through some kind of process on each side. And no question, once you have more than one person, running the show, there are issues with, do they get along? Can they find alignment? What happens if they disagree? I'm setting all that aside as well, because I think in general, those things can get worked out. But I think the advantage of having a dual kind of combined or hybrid structure here is it provides a direct point of contact for each side, for the organization side and the stakeholder side. It provides the ability to blend the different perspectives together and setting an agenda and actually running the meetings and making sure there's balanced input, not overlooking input, et cetera. I've seen this unusually enough in the UN climate process. I won't. There are a lot of problems with the UN climate process procedurally. Let me tell you, but one thing that does work, and there they have a secretariat which steps back, and then they have, generally speaking, co-chairs of the different working groups who come from the countries that are represented. And I'm not going to get into the details because I think it's not quite the same kind of thing. But the advantage of it is you get people who have experience and recognition from their peers, and they have some accountability in that way. They're not representing their organization when they or their country in the UN in that case when they take a chair of a working group, but they are accountable to the body as a whole. Of course, somebody from their, in that case, country or here stakeholder could also still step in and participate with that viewpoint. But what I'm suggesting is I'm thinking, how do we find a way to blend the advantages of both a staff-driven approach or a stakeholder-driven approach at the point where that process really focuses, which the role of the chairs or conveners or facilitators, whatever you want to call it. So I just want to put that out there as an idea that I think will help address some of the issues about access, about response, and about accountability.
Thanks, Fred, for your comments. Yeah, and I'm just going to expand this this third reflection question of which perspectives are you most comfortable with, which do you feel challenged by, and expand that not to only to include the perspectives that were shared by the panel members, but any perspectives that have been shared by participants in the discussion today. So in addition to my continued open invitation to any state regulators we have or consumer advocates we have, I'm curious if we have anyone from BPA or WAPA on the line that would like to share their perspective. And I'll invite your comments on any of the reflection questions, but I think in this moment, I'm most curious to hear of the perspectives that have been shared, which ones do you feel comfortable with and which ones do you feel challenged by? Yes, Vijay.
I think 70% of us on this call, I'm taking a guess here, number, it could be 40, it could be 50, it could be 90, could be challenged by is what I think we public interest sector have made a request to our Eastern partners to bring in their perspectives as well, is how do we bring the best from the East and yet create our own? My aunt used to make a very special kind of bread pudding, and she's no more, but every time I would show up she would surprise me with a new variation, so I could not predict what to expect. So we don't want the unexpected we cannot handle, but we need to predict what we don't want. We don't want a capacity market in the West yet. We do not want a governance structure that is too intricate. And we also don't want a governance structure that is monolithically dictated by 3 or 4 board members and a very pyramid-like structure that at the top there's decision making and done. So I just want to highlight that we're challenged by our over deliberative human thinking to wanting the perfect thing right now, but at the same time, we should come out with a very clear understanding of what are the things this group doesn't like at all from different markets. Put that on the table, and then come up with a new recipe for a pudding that we know we like, where these not good elements will not be there. That's my opinion of being challenged by. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay, and for the tasty analogy. Heidi.
Yeah, thank you. Heidi Rotz with the Clean Energy Buyers Association. So I do represent end-use customers, but mostly the large energy customers. And one comment I've been thinking all along is that I'm really encouraged by the discussion we've had on this call, the ability to hear from folks who have been engaged in different processes, not just CAISO and PJM, but across the board, combined with the resources like the paper from GridWorks. I think all of this has been really helpful, and it's given me a lot of hope that there can be change and we can find an innovative structure for the West. So really specific to your question 3, I think the perspectives I've heard today that I feel most encouraged and comfortable with are the ideas that we might need the tiering of different topics so that there's different types of stakeholder engagement. I think that's a really nice concept that we should think through and could be helpful for stakeholders who don't necessarily want to be engaged in every single type of topic and are also looking for some efficiency. And I also am really happy that this group has brought forward the concept that we really need to balance effort. Not all stakeholders are resourced in the same way, and making sure that folks can engage in a way that makes sense for them, I think is really beneficial and a positive step forward.
Thanks so much, Heidi, for your comments. I see a new commenter, Colin Smith.
Thanks, Neha. My name is Colin Smith. I'm a Regulatory Affairs Manager at LEAP, a demand response aggregator. I'd like to echo Heidi's gratitude for setting this up. It's been very informational and educational, and I appreciate it. Also, following up on Heidi, the perspectives that I was most comfortable with were, well, I suppose that in terms of structures, the approach that I felt most comfortable with was one that was more stakeholder driven. So a structure in which stakeholders are able to raise issues with the RO, have some sort of process outside of the staff deciding what is or is not important. I think it's important to have that staff expertise. I think that there's a lot of value in some of the collaborative approaches that have been discussed, where staff and stakeholders partner to kind of move priorities along. But I do think that, you know, the stakeholder process that CAISO has shifted to, that does allow for more opportunities for stakeholder driven or stakeholders to raise issues and get them on the agenda, is important to retain.
Thanks so much, Colin. Doug Marker from BPA.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
You can.
I was struggling with listening to it on a phone and watching it on my computer, so I apologize when you called on me. I was not prepared, and I'm still looking in the wrong computer. I think that in general, I can only echo what has been said about what we liked about the Markets Plus process, is that it did have structure. It was work group led. We've pointed out in our comments on both that we are trying to, we would like to see a more stakeholder-led issue development process. This discussion, I think, has really been concentrated on how to do this. It has recognized that we're trying to do something different than the older CAISO staff model. So we certainly support that. But then the other point is that this is all, from our perspective, the importance is that we're trying to get, we think we should be trying to get issues defined and developed so that there are there's a clear majority and minority perspective if necessary. The Markets Plus process has helped to facilitate developing consensus on some difficult issues. We were really skeptical going into the process about the voting aspect of it, but it served in some instances to really facilitate consensus. But what we really want is for the independent board to be able to see the diversity of stakeholder perspectives so that the issues are more clarified in that way, but the decision making is brought back to the independent board. So I wanted to contribute that, if that's helpful.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate that. While we're on SPP, do we have any folks on the line who are currently participants in SPP Markets Plus who have additional thoughts to share on how that process works and what they like about it, what they feel challenged by with that process?
This is Fred. I've had a limited amount of involvement with Markets Plus. So, given that narrow range of experience with it, I would say it's very orderly. The materials come out in time and are a lot of, the documentation of the process is quite good. The discussion, I think, has been reasonably open and, open to not just everybody, taking positions, but open to hearing about things and moving their positions. So that part is good. I'm not all that thrilled with the voting process. I think a lot of the voting in the groups I've been in has been, at what point do you get something that's ready to vote? Then you run into the issue of how much more time do you have in that session? So things tend to get piled up at the end. And also, I think there's a bit of a struggle. I have a lot of background being, in various kinds of committees and organizations. There are lots of issues with kind of the process for making motions and dealing with amendments and all that kind of mechanical stuff that I think it's not, it's common. It's not at all because of it being at SPP. It's just a real issue. So there's some mechanical issues with it. And then I have, again, I think we'll get back to this when we have the bigger discussion about voting. The question of how position formation happens and position taking in the voting process is a concern. I'll just put it that way. It provides some clarity, but it also may end up distorting the process a bit. And then one other thing I want to say, if I could right now, just to join my comment in the chat, which is the whole maybe this is a separate discussion, really, actually. The whole theory of majority and minority opinion. I know this is FERC terminology, and it's very common throughout the industry, that I don't find it very helpful because in a lot of cases, there are a range of opinions on different sides of an issue that need to be reflected all the way through the process, or you're going to lose something. But the tendency to group things together and then who defines what is the majority and the minority opinion? Well, the majority voted for something or, approved something. The minority opinion often does not get summarized and stated by the minority. It's somebody else who does that. And I don't find that very helpful either.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, and as you mentioned, our next workshop, which I want to say is next Thursday, we'll have more opportunity for discussion on voting and possible voting structures and things like that. Jessica.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to kind of raise another comment that someone else made. I think it was Mona Tierney-Lloyd in the last meeting that I thought was really interesting and accurate about the Markets Plus process. That's a challenge, actually, is that you do really have to be invested, and it's a single participant ownership model where each single participant really owns an outcome and has to be strongly engaged throughout the process. And so it's a big investment of time and energy. And sometimes, you know, Mona's point was sometimes you just want others to carry the water on an issue and you don't want to have to be so kind of strongly at the table. And so I think this discussion today is really helpful because we can consider options that look at, you know, a matrix of the good things and maybe the drawbacks of different models. So just thank you for the discussion. It's been helpful.
Thanks, Jessica. Following on my cold calling of folks, do we have any California utilities on the call today? I think I saw Jan at least in the chat, who'd like to share their perspectives on what they are comfortable with or challenged by in the process that they're participating in, the CAISO process. Or other processes that y'all have participated in, maybe when you haven't been working for a California utility. Tony, I see you're volunteering in the chat. Would you like to volunteer out loud?
Sure. Tony Braun. I represent several public power entities in California. I think I've never been in an organized market outside of the CAISO and the associated stakeholder process. I did attend several of the Markets Plus meetings on the front end. So I'd like to probably state the obvious on the front, which is just because there's not a formal committee and voting structure in the CAISO doesn't mean it's not resource intensive. It takes a lot of time to do correctly and persistently. And so I don't think anyone should have the sort of misperception that it's light-handed. But I do think obviously it does not have the extra workload and organizational burdens on stakeholders that maybe some of the other formal processes have. That said, I have observed for a while and have desired more accountability in the process on behalf of stakeholders. I think it's actually gotten better. And I'm not speaking just in terms of the working group process and the exchange of ideas, but maybe it's just evolution or a change in culture. But there does seem to be more stakeholder accountability. I think for a long period of time, the stakeholders viewed the outcome as someone else's problem. And there really wasn't an ownership in coming to a consensus position. And so that has historically been a concern of mine as it relates to the CAISO process. And then some of the failure to drive to an end goal. I think that has been a continuing issue that the CAISO and the market participants and stakeholders have wrestled with. So I think those are some of the things that some of us are hoping that this process can help, bring forth ideas that can ameliorate some of those concerns that I think are held by many. I did want to note, as an example, and some of the concerns that were raised, and this is sort of slightly off topic. As we look at some of the options going forward for doing this, we have where we were concerned about having a position that was a little bit outside of the mainstream position that the process was going to and forward, and how we were going to get our needs accommodated. I'll give you an example, and I won't go too long. It'll be a short example. When the flexible capacity product was first introduced, the proposal, which was very mature, was to just peanut butter the costs of it on a load ratio share basis. We had to fight tooth and nail to show the CAISO that our loads and resources did not look like everybody else's, or at least certain of the loads and resources. And in the end, we were able to convince them over to go to a more cost causation approach to it. And I can't help but think that that would have not happened in a voting structure, that we would have been an extraordinarily small minority and we would just get rolled over. So as we look at, and obviously I think we were going to win at FERC, but and that had something to do with it, but nevertheless, so sort of a specific example where there's something easy to do, but maybe it's not really the best design choice. And those are the kind of things that we think of in our history and go, what would have happened if? And so those are the kind of things we're looking out for as we go forward and consider these various structures to make sure that, you know, some entities that have valid interests are still able to, you know, get those interests accommodated.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, and I think you started to offer a little bit in terms of, you know, what would be some different key differences between some of the approaches that are on offer and how that might shape participation. So welcome folks to also begin to think about that fourth question on here while I call on Alan. Thanks so much, Alan.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks, Alan Meck from PG&E. So since you asked for the California perspective on how we've been participating and how our experience has been in the CAISO process, we think that the CAISO process has overall been pretty good. You know, we've had a couple of challenges, but I think that the benefit really has been that the CAISO process is able to organically capture large ideas, stakeholders. And so I actually personally think that there's been a benefit in not having like a really structured and rigorous, like you have to vote on this and you need X% of support from these groups. I think the CAISO process worked pretty well. But I'd like to conclude by just saying that we appreciate this conversation. It's been really good, getting a lot of different perspectives on things that have worked and haven't worked. And looking forward to future discussions.
Thanks, Alan. And I think I'm going to amend the fourth question on here, or just add a little bit of detail to it, something I'm curious about in hearing the different comments that have been shared. So the question on here is, what appear to be the key differences among the approaches offered? And I think I'd like to just add to that, maybe what appear to be the key differences among the approaches offered for different types of stakeholders. Right, so we've heard from utility folks, we've heard from some consumer reps, from regulators, from independent power producers. So yeah, I'm curious to hear, like, what are the key differences in the approaches in terms of like how different stakeholders are able to participate or able to engage in these four topics that are here on the left of the slide. I think we've heard from, yeah, thank you, Alan, for representing a utility perspective on participating in the CAISO process, maybe some non-utility folks that have participated in the CAISO process or the SBP process or another process, and sort of thinking about, you know, to Tony's example of like, okay, here's how my participation was in this one process, but how might it have been different elsewhere? And does that work for me? Does that not work for me? The challenging question. I'm lucky I'm the asker, not the answerer. Also open at this moment at this point to take any thoughts folks have on the 5th reflection question here. Hybrids or alternative ideas that the launch committee should consider. I think heard a lot in the discussion today that like, yes, we should there's good elements of many processes, we should borrow from those. And so if you were to sort of coalesce all of the the good parts of processes that currently exist, what would be your proposal for something that the launch committee should consider?
Vijay here, if I may.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, Vijay. I thought your hand was up from a previous.
No, I lowered down so I could raise it again. My bad.
No, all good. Thank you.
I think 3 things I would like to propose, very specific. One is the regional issues forum that I am selfishly biased about because I'm part of the RIF, but it is something that CalISO has that's a truly innovative construct that has improved and adapted over time. So the new RO structure should have a pathway of policy formulation that has the RIF. That'll be something like that. Number 2, the MISO transmission planning process is something we should not ignore because the FERC Order 1920 leverages the MISO 20-year horizon framing thinking that actually is very thoughtful and integrates a large number of Western states, a large number of Midwestern states. CalISO only has the experience and the liberty and the luxury of only one state to integrate with. So we should think about that. And third was, I think Scott or somebody brought up is a more flexible version of a very heavy PGM stakeholder process. These are 3 things that I feel we should be thinking about in terms of creating a concoction of the best bread pudding in the West. Thank you. I don't know why I'm fixed on bread pudding today. I'm not eating bread pudding, just saying. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm all now hungry for bread pudding. Jan, I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. I saw a comment you put in the chat earlier, thinking that you thought Fred Hewitt's suggestion of a joint stakeholder staff facilitation approach is interesting and worth pursuing. Do you have anything else you'd like to share about that? Like, what about that intrigues you? Colin, we'll go to you while maybe Jan finds their mute button. Colin, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to quickly comment on or continue with the thread that Vijay started. The kind of RIF structure that CAISO has that has a lot of benefits. There's also some challenges with it. I know that Scott earlier talked about how the IPP or stakeholder group that he represents is a very large and multifaceted group. It's kind of by nature less aligned than a consumer advocate group or a transmission owner group. And so in kind of developing a stakeholder-based forum, there's a need to be very intentional about creating stakeholder groups that are, I guess, analogous to each other and allow sufficient representation for all the different interests that are part of your stakeholder to the ISO as a whole. I think it's very easy to look at different stakeholder groups and say, oh, everyone has representation, but different stakeholder groups are not necessarily created are not created the same way. They're not necessarily the same in the sense that they have equal levels of alignment internally.
Thanks, Colin. I'm going to try a new-ish voice. I know you got an opportunity to participate in our panel, but Scott.
I just wanted to thank Colin. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Colin for that comment that the demand response providers as part of the RIF sector are relatively new to having their voice be prominent within the sector. I think it has been beneficial, certainly, to have the demand response sector, the VPP sector, be a greater part of this sector. And it's absolutely come up within the RIF to say, are some of the sectors too big? Is the ability of a sector to have a voice appropriate based on how it's currently structured? And we've always felt that if we have any internal conflicts within a sector, that would certainly be a time that we'd want to split, or if there is a sector that is not getting their voice to be heard. So when we did the original survey back in, let's see, when Kathleen did, I think in January, we did not have much DR representation at the time. The DR groups, including Colin, certainly were great at speaking up to say, hey, we don't feel represented. Can we be sure to be part of this? They're now part of the IPPM sector, but it is a evolving situation. And we've said, if, like Colin said, if there is a concern that the voice is not being heard, we're aware of that. And it's something that I think is important within this process to say how much delineation is appropriate and then how much is too much, where it starts just becoming a bit overwhelming. So I certainly just wanted to comment on what's going on within the RIF sector when it comes to representation, and appreciate Colin's comments.
Sorry, I was muted myself. Thank you, Scott, for your comments. Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick one on sectors. One of the things I like about the way the ISO has evolved things over the last decade, particularly with the nomination process for the boards and for the and also to some degree the RIF, is that the sectors are not, there's a kind of self-selection involved, but they've also been pretty flexible. And we've had, I think Catherine raised this last time, what if your organization actually fits into a couple of the sectors? How do you deal with that in different contexts? That's something to consider. And then how do you define the sectors? I'm sure it's no surprise we've had a long-running discussion within, between the public interest organizations, broadly speaking, and the consumer advocates, broadly speaking. This creates an issue for us because in some of our states, we kind of play a bit of the role of a consumer advocate in terms of, for example, getting involved in utility rate cases on behalf of, we don't have a formal definition of that the way that a state agency might, consumer advocate agency might, but we have some of the, characteristics of that. But should our sector, public interest sector, include or, have a separate group for the consumer advocate? This is a long running discussion, so some of these issues around the boundaries around the sectors and how many of the sectors do you have to be a reasonable a number and proper balance and so forth. That these are all tough issues, but I just want to reflect that I think we have built a lot of understanding and trust over the last decade in this process, and let's not forget that.
Thanks, Fred. And just a reminder that our workshop next week, there will be an opportunity to speak more in depth and discuss more in depth about sectors and sector definitions. So would like to keep us focused on our topic for today. Letha, I'm sorry. I'm not doing well with names today. Letha, go ahead.
Not at all. And I omitted saying my affiliation when I spoke last time. So Letha Tani with the Oregon PUC, of course, representing only my own perspectives. When I think about the hybrids or alternative ideas, sort of your reflection question 5, And I think about what has been successful or challenging around the balance between stakeholder-driven ideation and development of proposals versus staff-led efforts. I go back to my sort of underlying presumption around the structurally uncompetitive nature of the West and the need to be always safeguarding that public interest, and find when we have decision-making processes that are focused on sort of toting up votes or figuring out where the majority is, it can really miss real risks to customers. And sometimes that perspective about how something might go wrong is a minority view. And I think as a result, I keep coming back to, when I think about what's worked well in the West, it's empowering a really equipped board to see the breadth of perspectives clearly and to be able to weigh the public benefit, the public good, and balance interests across the market effectively. So I think where we have had a board that can really see into the stakeholder viewpoints and then make an independent decision based on that, to send something back for more work or to raise a question about a particular attribute or whatever, it served our customers better. And so finding ways to bring forward that diversity of perspectives is a key task of the stakeholder process, so that equipped board can make a choice that fits their duty to customers. And designing for that end, I think, is an important piece of our goal here.
Thanks so much for those detailed comments. Other thoughts? We have about 8 minutes left in our discussion, and really want to push y'all to think about what hybrids or alternative ideas should the launch committee consider. We have lots of good discussion today about, what people have felt comfortable with, what they feel challenged by. I think maybe like really digging into that, what do you feel challenged by? So what would you propose instead? I know we're at the end of a long workshop and I'm asking you to think creatively, which is challenging. Yeah, Letha, you have something you'd like to add?
Well, I appreciate that you're pushing us to be specific, so I will step up to that challenge. As a stakeholder who is not resourced to engage in these processes very deeply, I find the CAISO process as it stands, the work groups as they are evolving, totally agree with the spin comments, although I think, anyway, I won't go into that. I like how it doesn't ask what's your standing, why do you have a voice here, do you get to have a say in this? It's an all comers. And as a decision maker myself, who tries to run procedurally equitable processes, I really like that. There's always tweaks, ways it can be made better and more efficient. But I really value that a diversity of perspectives can get an airing all the way up to the board level, recognizing it's not perfect and that some folks still don't feel heard, as we heard earlier in the conversation. I think I struggle. I have participated in the Markets Plus process, and depending on your sort of working group chair and whether you are the appointed person for the working group, your level of voice is really different. And that that's challenging. I have found that challenging. It probably could be tweaked also, but I offer that.
Great, thanks for your honesty and candor. Ryan.
Yeah, this is Ryan Millard from NextEra Energy Resources. I guess it's kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Again, speaking on the CAISO side, which I know more, I'm more familiar with. The challenges, I think we've repeatedly asked for clarity on timelines for the working group structure, whether that's one working group, 2, 3 on the front end. And I think the CAISO saw this as overly limiting, which I recognize and understand, but I saw it more in terms of ensuring accountability and forward progression. We provided problem identification and issues for consideration, and we've offered we're offered an opportunity to present preferred solutions, but some of those solutions get explored while others aren't. And the CAISO didn't always document why a particular solution wasn't feasible and why it couldn't be explored. I think the formal committee voting process on proposals or elements of proposals can be overly limiting, like you see on some of the Eastern RTO structures. However, CAISO's attempt to poll stakeholders hasn't always been consistent. They'll document a summary of some of the comments they've received in a draft proposal, but what they pull in is at their discretion and what they pursue is at their discretion. And understanding why they led with some things and not with others, I think, can be a little confounding on the part of stakeholders and different sectors. One thing I have appreciated about CAISO is our access as stakeholders to board members. I feel like that has been easier, but oftentimes board members will ask us whether and how we've challenged the CAISO on topics we're escalating to board members. And since our concerns and feedback are not always well documented as part of the CAISO process, or at least not as documented as formally as I'd like it to be, that can be a real challenge. So I'm not bashing or against CAISO's structure. I think there's a lot of goodness there, but I do think there are elements that can be formalized to ensure that we are making progress in particular areas that have been stymied by a lack of organization. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. And I'm going to push you a little harder. So can you be a little bit more specific and just what are the elements that you want to be adjusted and how would you adjust them?
I think kind of what I just touched on. I think oftentimes with the working group, there's no end in sight. Pick a timeline. You can always change the timeline. CAISO has been resistant to do that. So what ends up happening is we have this just ongoing conversation with no end in sight. The most recent resource adequacy working group is a great example of that. Another example where we had this trickiness in the beginning and lost, I think, a lot of opportunity to get clarity that ended up impacting a lot of our projects was the interconnection process enhancements initiative that the CAISO rolled out. I don't think there was enough in the beginning attempts to kind of structure how the stakeholder process was going to move forward, and there wasn't timelines built in at the front end. In fact, that was my commentary through that process multiple times. Pick a date. You have a lot of conflicting or complicated, compliance filings at FERC that are going to make this more complicated, and sure enough, it did. So I think that lack of formality, while some people may view it as obstructive, I think it actually kind of forces you to have the conversations more quickly. And you can always have that willingness to, change it or extend it if you're just not getting consensus. But it's hard to figure out whether we are getting consensus because those things are documented. We just have conversations and then suddenly we have a draft proposal or we have yet another working group. That's what I've struggled with.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate your willingness to get specific for me. I'm going to open the floor for a last 1 or 2 comments, really focusing on this question 5, hybrids or alternative ideas that you would want the launch committee to consider as they develop a straw proposal.
Shoot. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah, you're a little funny.
Okay, sorry. Vijay here. Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
I think hearing everybody on this call, I would recommend the launch committee to think about a three-track stakeholder staff engagement mechanism. One is where the RO staff will propose stakeholder proposals for consideration and what will be the process around it. Second will be Fred's idea, which RIF has also talked a lot about, by the way, is a RIFs-like entity or stakeholder initiated proposals with staff support. And then the third would be a joint one. So you have different levels of ownership, you have different levels of RACI, responsibility, accountability, consult roles. But I think we should come up with this kind of a mechanism for consideration by the launch committee. Sorry, I request that this be considered. That's my summary thoughts of amalgamating everything I heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. We've got time for one last comment, or live comment, I should say. There'll be other opportunities to provide comment. All right. Could I get the next slide? Great. All right. So as with workshop 1, our discussion today will be documented in a report that will inform the draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal that the launch committee will put together. Our next workshop, as I've referenced a couple of times, is next week on August 2nd, which is Friday. It'll be the same time as our workshop today. Format will be very similar. And the topic for that workshop is what could a sector-based committee and voting structure add? Appreciate everyone's active participation and comments today. We know that these are complicated topics and you may have good ideas or additional ideas that come to you later on. And so there will be an opportunity to provide comments on the content covered in workshops 1 through 3. That comment opportunity will come after workshop 3, and GridWorks and the launch committee will provide some prompting questions to help you form your comments, your written comments. Written comments are certainly not mandatory. It'll just be another opportunity for you to voice your opinions. Any questions before we all go on with the rest of our days?
I want to just take a quick minute to also highlight the other upcoming Pathways workshops. We have an RO formation and governance workshop tomorrow, July 25th at 9 a.m. A public interest workshop on Wednesday, July 31st, also at 9 a.m. Pacific. A stakeholder process that we just covered here. And then the tariff analysis and CAISO issues workshop on Monday, August 5th. The stakeholder process workshop number 4 on August 28th. And all of these meetings and information is available at the Western Energy Board website under the Pathways Initiative page, or you can reach out to Kathleen or I or Sarah about having any questions. And I can put those dates in chat as well.
Thanks, Pam. And my colleague Serena also did put a feedback form link in the chat. As GridWorks, our job is facilitation. We're always trying to do better. So appreciate any constructive commentary or feedback that you have to offer. So Serena, if we could go, or sorry, Sarah, if we could go to the next slide. So yeah, appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to offer us some feedback. And thank you, Pam, for putting all of those other dates in the chat. And we look forward to seeing many of you again for our next workshop next Friday. Thanks all. Have a good rest of your day.